In this class we're going to look at the market price. We're going to look at the market mechanism to see how price of goods is determined. Now, throughout history this was a mystery to a lot of people. No one really knew how the price of goods emerged. It was believed, widely believed in fact, that the price of goods was a reflection of the amount of work that was gone to make the product, the amount of time it took to make the product and the amount of effort it took to make the product. Which seems common sense until we think that it may be that we have a lot of people making products that nobody wants, in which case it's all a waste of time, a waste of effort. The goods they're making have no value. So it fell to Alfred Marshall in 1890 in his book called The Principles of Economics to solve the problem of how the market works, and he did it through drawing up what we now term the supply and demand diagram. Let's see how it works. For a start, we set up the axes. So on the vertical axis we have the price per unit. We have to specify the unit, otherwise it would be a nonsense. If I said the price of petrol was £2, it doesn't make any sense. Is it £2 a gallon, £2 a litre? What is it exactly? It makes a lot of difference. So we must specify a unit of measurement. So it's the price per unit, PU. And on the horizontal axis we have QT, quantity per unit of time. If I said again that my demand for milk was 2 pints, is it 2 pints a day or 2 pints a year? It makes a lot of difference. So we must specify a time period. And providing we've done this, providing we've specified the time period in the quantity axis and the price per unit on the vertical axis, then we have properly set up our supply and demand axes. These are the ones we should use. Now, we'll insert on here a downward sloping demand curve. Generally speaking, we believe demand curves slope downwards, that as products become cheaper, we buy more of them. There are exceptions. There are many exceptions, which I'm not going to go into in this session, but there are many exceptions. But generally speaking, for most goods, as the price falls, we buy more. It's cheaper. A lot of effort has gone into demand curves by economists to see if there are what's called empirical demand curves, ones based on evidence, and a lot of econometrics and statistics have been used, and a lot of brain power has been used to try and work out if demand curves are downward sloping and what are the attributes of various demand curves. Probably a better route to go is that of the Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, who said demand curves slope downwards because it's a technique, it's a conceptual device. It helps us think. And it makes a lot of sense that as products become cheaper, we demand more. So we have a device for thinking. It's not a practical device, it's a mental device. It helps us to rationalize and understand the market. We also have the supply curve, which is upward sloping. Again, we said the demand curve was downward sloping. We said that's a behavioral reason for it. The price falls and we demand more. For the supply curve, you could insert the same type of reasoning. You could say, well, as the price of a good increases, producers have more incentive to supply more. So the supply curve is upward sloping. As the price rises, producers step up production. There are technical relationships here as well, which we are not going to get into, but I'll mention just for completeness. The supply curve is actually the upward sloping marginal cost curve for a company operating under conditions of perfect competition. In fact, it's the horizontal summation of the supply curves for companies operating under condition of perfect competition. So it's the marginal cost curve, the summation of the marginal cost curves for companies operating under perfect competition. It's not something we're going to get involved in, but purists will want to know if there is a link between the market and the theory of the firm and the supply curve. Well, there is one. It's a little tenuous, but it's there. I think it's far better for us to say that the supply curve slopes upwards because as the price rises, the producer gets more. And the increase in price to the producer induces more production. It means that the producer has more incentive to supply the good. Now, when we put the supply and demand diagrams together, we get what's known as the Marshallian cross, which is named after Alfred Marshall that I mentioned earlier. And this is probably one of the most powerful techniques of the social sciences. This is a very powerful piece of analytical equipment. This is a very powerful explainer of the market. And I think we should understand this one. This is essential. So let's start with a price of P1. At a price of P1 you can see that the supply exceeds the demand, which is a surplus. The supply is greater than demand. There's a surplus. Now, in order to clear the surplus, producers will cut the price. They'll have a sale. They'll try to get consumers to buy more of the product. So they will cut the price, thus stimulating demand. And by cutting the price, they will also cut back on production. So we'll get downward pressure. The downward pressure on price means the price starts to fall, the demand is increased, the supply is decreased, and we are converging on the point of intersection of the supply and demand curves. This point is known as the point of equilibrium, the point of balance. So when we get there, we call it PE, QE, the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And the forces are there. The forces are automatic. There's no government or there's no force being used here. This is just, it's happening. It's what Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations back in 1776. It's a bit like what he called the invisible hand. The market works. It just works because people organize themselves. They organize themselves in a way that tries to clear problems and promote self-interest. And in this case, the producers are trying to get rid of the surplus, so they cut the price and cut back on production. We head towards the equilibrium. So the equilibrium is the point of intersection of supply and demand. Now, for a shortage, we have demand is greater than the supply. So we have upward pressure. Demand greater than supply signal to the producer that the consumers don't get enough of the product. They want more of the product. There are queues of people waiting to get the product, and people think it's exceptional value. There might even be a second-hand market for it. There might be people buying the product and then trying to resell it at a profit. Perhaps sell it online or sell it wherever, but there might be secondary markets. Now, secondary markets indicate the shortage. So the price is increased. An increased price moves back to the equilibrium. So it doesn't matter where we start on this diagram. It seems that the forces of the market pull us to the equilibrium. If we're above the equilibrium or below the equilibrium, there are forces in play that move us to the equilibrium. And that's the basics of supply and demand. Now, what happens when there are changes in supply and demand? Well, suppose that the demand for the product increases because the product becomes more fashionable, let's say. So suddenly the item is more fashionable, people want it. In this case, the demand curve shifts to the right, to D1, D1. Now if the demand curve shifts to the right, then of course what was the equilibrium will now be a situation of shortage. The demand, because it's now gone out to D1, D1, it's no longer D, there's now a shortage. And that means there are upward pressures on the price. The shortage means the producers will increase the price to try and curb the queues, and also will step up production. So we move to a new equilibrium. And that's the new equilibrium. PE new, QE new. The new equilibrium quantity and the new equilibrium price. Suppose that the cost of raw materials is reduced in price, so the supply curve is shifted to the right. Well, here's the supply curve shifted to the right. It looks like it's shifted downwards, but it's shifted to the right. We have the equilibrium in place, and now you can see at the old equilibrium PE there is a surplus. So at the surplus it means that too much is being produced, so the producers need to cut the price. By cutting the price, they're going to stimulate demand and cut back on production. So we're going to move to this new equilibrium. Which makes sense. If we hear that the price of raw materials has just fallen, we expect the price in the shops to fall as well. The price of those products that use the raw materials, those should fall as well. And we'd also expect to see more of the product available. So the diagram accords with our experiences. It makes sense. We also have this idea of minimum price policies, and let's look at one here, the minimum wage. Now take this diagram for example. Let's say that the government insists upon the wage being W1 per hour for workers. So the wage can't fall. That's the minimum wage in the country. It's a legal requirement at W1. Now we know the equilibrium in the market here would be W. So let's look at what happens at W1 versus what happens at W. The market solution is W, but the government wants workers to be paid W1. The government wants workers to get minimum wage. And let's say the minimum wage here is W1. Now if that's the case, then the supply of workers at W1 will be C. The demand for workers at W1 will be A. So there's an oversupply, which means unemployment. Unemployment being the difference between C and A. There are C workers looking for jobs at W1, but the employers only want A at W1 because workers are expensive at W1. So the difference between C and A is really unemployment. Now what happens if there was no minimum wage? Let's say the government did not have W1. Let's say the market worked. In which case the wage would fall to W, so workers would get paid less. But there'd be a bigger demand for workers. The demand would not be at the point E. The demand would be at the point F. So there'd be a bigger demand for workers, and there'd be fewer workers looking for employment because the wage is now lower. So the supply of workers would be B, and the demand for workers would be B. So there would be an equilibrium at F. Now, what do we make of all of this? Well, at E, some workers are lucky and have got jobs. If the wage was W, more people would have had jobs, but there'd be more people working, but working for less. And that's what this particular diagram illustrates. Now, as I said earlier, there are many different types of situation we could encounter here, and this diagram could be moved around in all sorts of ways, and the curves may not look like I've drawn them there. They could be far more steep, or they could be flatter, or whatever. So the analysis can be twisted around in various ways. But the logic of what I've just said stands. Let's look at maximum pricing policies. The government states the maximum price for goods. Let's say the government here specifies the maximum price that customers should pay for a good is P1. Now we know the equilibrium price is P, but the government states that no one should pay more than P1. If that's the case, suppliers will cut back. They won't produce B, they'll produce A. And because the price is P1, consumers will want more of it. It's cheaper. So consumers will want more. Their demand will move up to C. So at P1, the demand will be C and the supply will be A. In other words, a shortage. In other words, customers will not be able to get what they want. There will be a shortage of the good. There may be black markets developing for the good, if it's possible. Some people may buy it and sell it on at a higher price. Sometimes it happens with football tickets to a match. The authorities who run the match fix the price at a certain amount per seat, but fans of the match, fans of the teams, want to pay more because they want to see the match. So, having got the ticket, people then try to sell the tickets at a higher price. It's a secondary market. Now let's look at the incidence of tax. Where does if the government imposes a tax on a product, who pays the tax? Is it the consumers or is it the producers? Now this diagram looks absolutely horrendous, but let's deal with it. Let's first of all look at the supply curve SS. I'll just deal with that. That's the supply curve, and the demand curve, of course, is DD. So the initial equilibrium is at the point P. Let me just put the cursor onto here. That's the initial equilibrium price, and this here is the equilibrium quantity. Sorry, the price. B is the equilibrium quantity. I beg your pardon. So B is the equilibrium quantity. Now, let's say the government imposes a tax on the product. The tax is equal to T. So the government imposes the tax T, which moves the supply curve up to S1. Now at S1, the new equilibrium will be P1 plus T here, and the equilibrium quantity will be at the point A. Now let's compare what's happening here. Well, originally the price was at P, but now the consumers have to pay a higher price. So the higher price paid by the consumers is this amount here, the one I'm indicating. That's what the consumers pay. The producers pay this amount here. The difference between the supply curve, the original supply curve, what they make it for, and the price that they got. So that's what the producers pay. So if we take the tax here, we can break this line here into two parts. The amount paid by the consumers and the amount paid by the producers. So we break this one down, and here it is down here. It's the same length, it's the same line, except this part down here is now paid by the producers, and this part up here is paid by the consumers. So when we have a tax on a product, we can work out the incidence of the tax, who pays what. And of course this will critically depend on the slope of the supply and the demand curves. But I've just drawn it this way so we can start the analysis and see how that works. So in this class, what we've looked at is supply and demand, how supply and demand works. We've looked at shifts in the supply, shifts in the demand curve, and how the market re-establishes itself. We've looked at minimum prices and maximum, and then we've looked at the incidence of tax. And these are important issues that everyone who understands supply and demand and who has encountered supply and demand as a part of their studies, this is what they must know. This is essential. But that's all I'm going to do here, so I'm going to leave it at that for now and say thank you for watching.